Thank you, Subasri and Madhu and PLD for organizing this conversation. I've known Sheba Chhachhi for almost 25 years, and I still remember that I first saw you, Sheba, in a sea of women who were demonstrating during the time of the Muslim Women's Bill. And I was also this, woman shooting. You were shooting with a still camera, and I was shooting with a video camera. And I have to say that it was an incredibly empowering and very comforting presence to see you there, because you didn't see many women with the camera then. And so a few years later, when I decided to make Three Women and a Camera, along with Homai Veerawala and Dayanita Singh, it was but natural that Sheba should be one of the protagonists, the third protagonist of this film. And Three Women marked the beginning of a friendship. But so we've been friends for so long, but we've been fellow travelers for all the things that we collectively believe in. I like to think that way. And I'm a great admirer of her practice, and it's a privilege to be able to speak to her and have a conversation with her today. So I'm going to start with the question that we asked you, Sheba, in the film, which is that you began your practice as a documentary photographer, and you were one of the first artists in the 1990s to work across platforms with multimedia and installation. And the question that I will ask is that why did you find documentary photography in its conventional sense of its realist avatar limiting?
First of all, thank you all. Thank you, PLD, Madhu, Subasri. And it is really a pleasure to be in conversation with Sabeena, with Gadi, as we all call her. We've been hoping and planning and dreaming of doing this for a long time. So I'm really pleased that we're finally getting to it. I started as a documentary photographer, very much, as you described, kind of part of the women's movement. I was photographing, literally pointing the camera one moment and shouting slogans the next. It was making a record of our struggles, our campaigns, our resistance, primarily around, in those years, this is a stretch from 1980 to about 1990, early 90s, excuse me. And I was recording this, I was documenting this for ourselves primarily. It was not for publication in mainstream media. It was to share with other women in the movement, perhaps in other parts of the country, or even beyond the country, our struggles. It was also to do with wanting to develop images which interrogated dominant representations of women, where they were either victims, or they were housewives, or they were these bejeweled, beautiful creatures that we received through advertising, magazines, and television. Let me share some of the images, the early images. It's a tiny excerpt from what's actually a very large archive, so that you get a sense of what images I'm talking about. So I start with an image which has perhaps become very well known. It is in the heat of an anti-dowry protest in 1980, Satyarani Chadda. A sit-in outside the Nangloi police station, street theater, huge demonstrations, joint platforms on International Women's Day, public testimonies, Om Swaha, the classic play about dowry that was performed by multiple performers and had many iterations, both within Delhi and across the country. The range of issues that we engaged with, I'm sure all of you are familiar with, but essentially it was around violence against women, which ranged from dowry, rape, domestic violence, sexual violence, as well as violence at the workplace, as well as issues of communalism, which were becoming completely urgent. So this is actually an image of one of the widows after the 1984 pogroms, where the Sikhs were murdered in Delhi. And this just gives you a whiff of what is actually quite a large archive of images. However, as I did this work, by the kind of end of the 80s, a number of questions began to really trouble me. First, as feminists, we were questioning power relations. We were questioning power relations within the family. We were looking at patriarchal structures of state, of society, of family, power relationships at the workplace, power relationships within intimate interpersonal relationships. And I began to think about the power relationships that were vested in me being the woman with the camera representing other women. So this was one of the things that troubled me. Alongside, at this time, a number of questions came up in my mind about the nature of the documentary photograph itself. We were presented with documentary images as objective, as real. This is photography's claim to truth, as it's often called. We received these images as indexical, as evidential. However, as we all know now, perhaps more today than at that time, that photography, while it has this very close relationship with the real, it seems to mirror the real, it actually interprets the real. It is an interpretation of what you see. It involves a series of inclusions and exclusions, from the very act of framing to what you include in the frame, what you leave out, to the kind of image you finally select from the number of images you've made, to what is then brought into the public realm. There's a series of exclusions. The pretense or even the lie of objectivity that was presented by mainstream media was something that I feel really needed to be countered. Images, photographic images, my images were constructed, and I wanted to make that construction explicit. I wanted to bring the fact that this was actually a subjective interpretation rather than an objective depiction of reality. So I entered into a kind of collaborative experiment with 8 women, feminists, fellow travelers in the women's movement. This is Shahjahan Appa, who I first encountered in 1981, making a very powerful public testimony on the boat club grounds, holding a photograph of her daughter who was murdered for dowry. She went on to become a very powerful activist and co-founded with Satirani the Shakti Shalini shelter, which helped women in such situations. With Appa, Satirani, Shanti, you'll see some of these images. What I did was to invite each one of these women to collaborate with me to create an image that would somehow tell her story, that would bring in her subjectivity, her narratives, how she felt she wanted to be represented. I would ask each woman to select a place, objects, a posture, a gaze, and then we would work together within this kind of mise en scène, a kind of theatrical setup, and create a series of images. We would then look at these images, sometimes returning to change, sometimes trying out different sites, different locations. And this was a long drawn, intimate process, often stretching over several months with each particular woman. Sitting on her bed, holding her burqa on her hand, she said, I cannot leave the burqa out of my story, but neither can I wear it. So this was how she solved that, by having it there. Behind her are the accumulations through labor and a series of struggles of precious objects, the calendar, the crockery, the steel glasses, and most critically, the sewing machine, which was a very important part of her finding some kind of economic independence. She also brought this little hut made out of a shoebox. And she said, मेरी कहानी झुग्गी झोंपड़ी की कहानी है, तो झोंपड़ी का भी होना यहाँ जरूरी है. On the right, you see the setup, the stage, the mise en scène without Appa. And on the left, you see her within that. She also included images that I had taken of her over the years. She was a very powerful public speaker, and I had photographed her over 10 years. and I had a large number of photographs. We selected some of those and placed them also within this frame. When I finally presented this work, I presented it as multiple images, images which drew from the 10 years of photographing Appa, as well as the staged portrait. For me, this countered again an idea which was very dominant and remains dominant in photography, of a portrait capturing the singular essence of a person. In that moment, the essence of the being is revealed. While in fact, we all know that the very next moment, another photograph would perhaps present a different aspect of that same person. So I thought of these as multiple pegs around which you could weave a story, an entry, a mosaic, an assemblage, which would reveal multiple aspects of the particular woman, and not only, to kind of try this idea of the simple, singular, essential. For lack of time, I won't go into detail on each one of the stage portraits, but this is Satyarani, who chose the steps of the Supreme Court. These are about 71 legal files that she was working with. She became a kind of paralegal worker who assisted a number of women, and as always, the photograph of her daughter in the graduation gown and her wedding sari, which became very much part of her particular mise en scène. I mean, you know that it's illegal to actually photograph in the Supreme Court, but Satyarani ji managed the guards and everything brilliantly while I carried on making the images. There's a more intimate portrait of her with the same props that she had chosen, but in her own space at home. And of course, the first time I encountered her in 1980 in the anti-dowry demonstration. Shanti, I'm just showing you the stage portrait. Devi Kripa, the staged portrait. Urvashi, the staged portrait. So these became a work which is called 7 Lives and a Dream. And for me, it really altered my entire approach to photography, moving away from the documentary to the staged collaborative photograph was for me something that was much more resonant with the kind of feminism and the kind of feminist philosophy that I wish to work with. I would say that we worked in an intersubjective place, a place that the images that we produced were out of her subjectivity as well as mine. And together we created a possibility of performing the self, of offering a kind of agency to the subject of the photograph, altering the balance of power between the woman behind the camera and the woman in front of it somewhat.
Okay, so Sheba, if I can pick up from there, because when you were speaking, I was a memory came back, and we didn't play that clip, but I think it's time now to play the clip from the film. I was thinking of the time when I was editing the film and I shared my rough cut with you in 1998. And I remember you calling me up at night and saying that you didn't think that the sequencing was quite right. And then when I spoke to you the next morning, I realized why. And the reason for that was that I hadn't quite got the fact that, I mean, or rather in that whole attempt to kind of compress everything in 1 minute of film time, because film cannot capture things as it unfolds, you know. In that attempt to capture it all in 1 minute or 2 minutes of screen time, what I had missed was somewhere in the editing of putting together the fact that you had photographed these women over almost a decade before you did these staged portraits. And I remember that we rearranged that edit, and it just, I'm so grateful for that suggestion, because it really immensely improved that sequence. And I think that this is the time, we forgot to play it in the beginning, but I think this is the time to play that clip very quickly. So it's a little under 2 minutes, but it's a clip from 3 Women and a Camera.
I was wondering what happened to the clip.
So we'll play it right now.
Okay. A mosaic. For me, it was again shifting away from this single image which would encapsulate the essence of a person, because I was moving away from essences which summarized and ultimately stereotyped.
can you tell me, what are you doing in this place?
Looking for photographic frames in Mughal arches. One of the reasons I love this place is because of the incredible overlap of history. If you walk up here, you'll see a horrible red brick structure next to a large steel water tower, next to the dome of parts, fragments of this 16th century monument. You'll hear the honks of buses, you'll hear these mad birds chittering in the background. And if you listen very carefully, you hear the silence of this place as well. And for me, this is what Delhi is about, and it's also about the kind of history that to do with my notions of history, which is about the simultaneous coexistence of multiple times, which is what excites me about this culture that I live in.
I really love this sequence because it is playful, and I remember that we had a lot of fun while shooting it. But my question is going to lead from here, which is and is related to something that you said also in the film, where you talked about how I mean your art, we know, is, you know, it's structured through an intersection of the still image and the very slowly meditative moving image. You talked in the film about how you had a problem with this quick consumption of images. Why is slowing down and reflection so integral to your practice?
Uh, Along with the kinds of questions, the critical inquiry into the nature of the documentary, I was also troubled by what I saw as an increasingly commodified way of relating to the photographic image. We are inundated with the photographic image. Magazines, and of course now at that time the internet wasn't so powerful, but the internet, the phone, mass media, television. I mean, we are continuously receiving a barrage of images. Even those images that are framed and put on walls seem to kind of blur into this way of looking. And it's this quick look, one image, and you think you've got it. You've got the basic information. So if you're looking at Satyarani's image, you're seeing a woman holding up a photograph, seems to be part of some kind of protest or agitation, and you've moved on. Did you actually notice the tear in the corner of her eye? Did you notice that the woman in the photograph that she's holding wears a graduation gown? Did you actually enter the image? So I was interested in trying to change this habit-ridden encounter with the photograph. And one of the things, one form of doing it was to build the kind of narratives that I built in 7 Lives in a Dream. But another form of doing it was to actually take the photograph off the walls, to bring them into space, so that to set up the conditions for a more embodied encounter. Also strategies of layering. I actually used to watch people walk into an exhibition or an installation, and I would see them walk in quite swiftly, still with the buzz of the city around them. And then as they encountered an image and they looked at it and they realized perhaps there was something behind it, and perhaps if they moved, they would see something slightly different, that they would begin to slow down. I think a lot of my work is basically about making people slow down. And why do I want them to slow down? Essentially, it's about the quality of attention. What is happening to us? I mean, if we say that the mind is the colony of today and we are being colonized by the kind of media manipulation of our minds, eyes, and ears, the key thing that is happening is a fragmentation of our attention. Our attention span is shrinking. I found it myself during the pandemic. I probably spent more time on screen, like probably everybody, than I ever have before. And I found my own span of concentration, which otherwise is quite different, changing. I was jumping from one thing to the other. I was sometimes opening 3 windows at the same time, something I had never done. So to try and produce a quality of attention also creates the possibility of critical thinking, of questioning, of building a kind of dialogue. And all that I do is very much about opening a conversation, about building some kind of dialogue with the viewer, with the person who I know don't think of as just a viewer, but as a participant in this conversation that my work tries to open up.
One of the things that you mentioned, taking off from something that you just said, you said that you layer your work. And I want to now draw attention to the fact that your work, you keep coming back to previous work by layering it and adding new meaning to it. And in some ways, I feel that your work morphs into and folds into new bodies of work, but you never really leave the older body of work. And I want you to talk a little bit about that.
Yes, there's a process of constantly circling back, a kind of recursive process. And perhaps I'll share some images of the many iterations of the images that you just saw from the archive of the women's movement and 7 Lives in a Dream, which has actually appeared differently in different ways. So I'll go back to sharing my screen. Okay, so I made a series called Wild Mothers 1 and 2, and I'm just showing you Wild Mothers 2. What I did here was essentially, as part of this attempt to alter the encounter with the photographic image, build in time, bring time back into viewing, I essentially made the image itself transparent. And in making it transparent, I was able to build layers across lines of sight as you enter the installation. The other thing that happens in this work is a layering of 2 kinds of women seeking transformation. Feminist activists seeking social transformation and transformation of their gender identities, and women ascetics seeking transformation from within through a different kind of alchemy. So as you enter the installation, there's this text, this opening poem. And you come in, you encounter these figures who are like a kind of ancient chorus, witnesses, women who've been there since centuries. And you go in and you see these transparent images that are hanging free in space. On the floor is a reflective film where you see self-reflected. So as you actually look at any one of these images, you are also seeing yourself. You are part of this narrative. So there are the transparent photographic images, and on this heap of coal, which is in the center, are reproductions of images of such women through history. So here you see Buri, a woman ascetic I encountered in my travels in West Bengal. And through her, you see that same image of Satyarani. I mean, this is very hard to actually experience through still images, but I hope you get some sense of how this works. So right now you're standing directly in front of this image, but if you were to move even slightly to the right, you would actually see a different sequence of images beginning to layer up. And you would constantly be reminded of the fact that you are part of this story, of this struggle for transformation, because your own image reflects back from the transparent material on the floor. To take a slight side track, I thought I would share with you some of the work that I did around the women ascetics. This is, Wild Mothers is early 90s, and this was the time that the Hindu woman was being re-inscribed within patriarchal mainstream Brahmanical Hinduism. Whether it was the new serials, whether it was the various kinds of laws that were coming up, whether it was incidents such as being in an anti-sati demonstration and finding that all the floats carrying these images glorifying sati had anti-dowry banners at the back. So these contradictions and the rise of Hindu fundamentalism and its kind of the way that it was presenting religion and women was contrary to the kinds of women that I had encountered in my travels, who were ascetics and who in fact came from heterodox traditions, traditions which actually questioned a number of these patriarchal assumptions, the contradiction between sexuality and spirituality, the tensions between the domestic and the spiritual. So these were women who had moved beyond being defined by the family. They were not wives, they were not mothers, they were not daughters. They were perhaps lovers, but their love, their desire, their passion was transformed towards a metaphysical figure. I was, of course, very influenced by the kind of poetry I encountered of such women through history, Akka Mahadevi, Lal Ded, a number of such women. And here I'm just sharing some images of the actual process of initiation, where each woman is stripped of her clothes, her hair, all the markers of gender, her name, the name of her village, the name of her parents, going back 7 generations. She actually performs the death rites, which is what you're seeing in this image, for 7 generations of the family that she has come from. She is reborn as a daughter of the Ganga, or the river, and takes on a peculiar kind of aspect which is beyond the domestic, which challenges the domestic. The other very powerful thing about these women is their mobility. They move, they travel, they wander, something that the domestic woman or even the undomesticated woman who is within the confines of patriarchal structures does not do without great trepidation. There is the emergence of a kind of sorority amongst the women, and they have their own niche within the broader social structure. These are largely Shebite women. They often take on androgynous aspects. In a sense, they play with gender, which I found very, very interesting. There's a lot more that I could say, but I'm not going to for lack of time. But Buri, for instance, became an important figure and started appearing in many works as a kind of metaphor for the bridge that I was interested in making. I was also very, very interested in what one could call vernacular forms of feminism, feminism that did not fit into our contemporary frames or ways that we describe feminism, but in fact had a powerful transformatory message. Another iteration of these images is in many, many years later, when I returned to the archive in 2012. It's a photo video installation called Record Resist. And when I returned to the archive, I felt it was very important to annotate this. And the most honest way that I could annotate it was through my own personal memories. That was a still from the video describing an experience of being in the mortuary at Ames, photographing a young woman post-autopsy who had been murdered. This is the installation. The images now hang in space, and the video is projected on the floor, and the eye moves between the video, which is quite slow, 17 minutes long, and the images, and you receive them both as a whole, as well as you are able to meet with each individual image and each individual woman or each individual group of women also separately, as you can see here. So I'm just playing you a short clip from the video, which is about how memory arises, not necessarily chronologically, but like bubbles to the surface of the mind, and the question of the archive. So as you see, there's a recursive process. I keep returning to certain images, but each time they are articulated differently. And of course, across time, the meanings of these images change. 2012 was really quite uncanny. One of the sequences in the video actually talks about the loss of public space, and we used to protest in on Boat Club, down Rajpath, Parliament, etc. Now we were corralled into Jantar Mantar, this designated place for public protest. So I have a section which shows the ghosts of demonstrations moving across India Gate. And then with the outrage that erupted at the brutal gang rape and murder of Jyoti Pandey, India Gate was occupied again. It was uncanny. It was a month after I'd finished it.
Yeah. And we find something similar happening today as well. Sheba, I was very happy to see that little bit because I never saw Record Resist. And so I'm really happy to see that little glimpse. At least I could see that. I want to get back to this idea of your work as a feminist artist, and you constantly interrogate questions of ecology. It runs through all your work, urban transformation, religious fundamentalism. The artworks are always grounded in a social context. I'm going to come to form with my next question, but for the time being, we stay with the whole idea of the citizen artist. You called yourself a citizen artist. I want you to respond to that. How do you explain that?
The term, it's not without its problems, but what it does indicate very clearly is a social commitment. It's basically an artist who brings her capacities, her skills, her imaginary to issues, concerns which have a meaning for society, for community. It's about a commitment to doing that. In a sense, all art practice is about, reflects, and engages with society because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. But work that is explicitly, in a sense, ideological, which chooses to make that commitment and to focus on that, is, I think, important to distinguish. So that's why the term citizen artist becomes a useful one. Artist activist is another formulation, which I think is a little more tricky because our idea of what is activist is perhaps closer to what I was through the 1980s up to the mid-90s, where I was very much on the street. I was also part of various things in the women's movement. But after that, a lot of my activism went into the sphere of art. which has been criticized, I mean, as an elite space, a space that is actually not something that's accessible to ordinary people. But for me, there were several things that became possible with this movement. One was a lot of the more complex kind of understandings that we were developing within the movement. A lot of research and scholarship and reflection was not actually being communicated except within academia and a little bit in cinema, I think. So I was very interested in bringing these ideas into public discourse. And what I did in the early years, very consistently, in fact, continue to do, was to bring women that I knew from women's groups into the installations. And the early work was all in cultural centers, community centers, and places like that, not so much in art galleries. So that's another aspect of being a citizen artist, is the engagement with who you wish to speak to, and always something that I do is always have discussions, always have some form of conversation, organized discussions around works, which for me is a very important part. Of course, the work itself embodies my concern and my deep interest in what happens with the viewer participant.
Would you like to speak about the Kashmir work with Sonia Jabbar?
Yes, I would.
The gun is raised.
Yeah, I would come to that. Let me go back to sharing screen. So this is a work that came out of over 10 years of engaging with Kashmir. When I first visited Kashmir, it was part of a women's small women's group that basically wanted to just go and listen to what women were saying. The media was completely dominated by representations around conflict, dominated by sets of men with guns. We did not know what was happening with the women, and we didn't know what they had to say. So what we tried to do in this installation was to actually create a third space, a space that tried to move out of the polarization, the absolutely homogenized discourse of India versus Pakistan, us versus them, Muslims versus Hindus, etc., and to create a third space. And the work actually, the testimonies were gathered from women first in that initial visit, and then over many years by Sonia, who continued to return to Kashmir and engage, and has written and made a film and another installation about Kashmir. But in this work, we essentially try and step behind the screen of the media representation of Kashmir. And this is archival. We went back to the 1940s and pulled out newspaper reports to move into a domestic space. The materials are very humble. Earth, brick platforms on which is rice, on which rice is laid, and rehals. It's a somewhat subversive insertion of rusted iron books into the rehal. The rehal conventionally carries holy books, the Gita, the Bible, the Guru Granth Sahib, the Quran. Here we replace that with these rusted iron books on which are pasted, mounted photographs and testimonies. These voices are drawn from a range of subject positions in the Kashmir conflict, from pundits, women who have been abused at the hands of militants, women who are with the militants, women who have been abused at the hands of the army, etc., etc. So in doing this, we try and kind of create a third space. There was a huge amount of anxiety over showing this work. In fact, the organizers got very nervous and removed their name from the installation before it opened in Delhi in 2000. But the response was extraordinary. It was almost as though people were looking for the possibility of another kind of conversation around Kashmir. We have a wonderful record of these visitors' books in which people have written page-long responses and comments. We also had organized discussions with peace groups, with universities, college students, etc., etc., etc. And this is an older work, but I'm sorry to say that it still remains relevant because the undeclared proxy war in Kashmir continues. And the kinds of voices that we tried to present, which were the voices of compassion and intelligence from the women, who also were looking for a solution, have been once again drowned out.
But I also want to draw attention here to your engagement with form, because I think that this is as important as the very political, nature of the content that you deal with. In other words, I feel that the way you tell your story is as important as the politics of your story, the content of your story. And in your book, you have this and I'm going to hold it up for everybody. I'm one of the proud owners of this book, Arc Silt Dive, which is a kind of a mid-career retrospective, and I hope that there will be many more books on your work. Several writers have very, very eruditely, commented on the very large archive that you draw upon, that you and the varied kinds of forms. So you draw upon pre and postmodern forms of knowledge, the spoken word, diaries, poetry, found images, you repeat images constantly, and there's a very interesting way in which I think Kumkum Sangari has actually talked about your repetitive use of images as a kind of an archive made of copies. And she says that it's very much like it not only draws from Asian contexts of storytelling where you constantly repeat things, but also from a feminist practice of reuse, thrift and kind of reuse. You use new and old forms of media, you use installation, where you often talked about how, the sensory aspects of what your art is very important. And you spoke about that earlier, which, moves us away from the tyranny of the visual. So you've constantly dealt with all of this in your form. And I now want you to turn to that and perhaps give us a glimpse into another fascinating body of work.
So let me just begin by saying that for me, form and content are completely integral to each other. I am not married to any particular medium as an artist. Many artists are. I mean, the photograph will always appear in my work. I guess there's some kind of ongoing relationship there. But a work takes on form because of the kind of questions I'm asking, because of the inquiry. The inquiry produces sets of images, ideas. I start working with the form. The form then produces another set of questions. So there's a kind of loop between the actual making, the initial idea, and how this resolves itself into form. I mean, in the work that I'd like to share now, I've moved substantially into what I would call an immersive multisensorial environment, implicating the body to create embodied kinds of experiences has become critical to my work and continues to this day. So I'll show you a work that I think is quite good to look at in the light of some of these ideas. So this is a work called Neelkant, Poison Nectar, and it's a video installation. It also uses many other elements, and it's basically a kind of contemplation, a reflection on poison and on the poisoning of the city, the poisoning of the senses. And I work with the myth of Neelkant. Okay, let me sort of rewind. Works often start either from a personal experience, maybe from a newspaper report, maybe from an article, maybe from something, a figment remembered from a dream, multiple ways. And once something begins to seed itself in my mind, I begin to look around. I kind of circle around that, almost like a dog looking for a place to sit down. And with Nilkant, it began with actually my becoming extremely allergic every time I went into the city to the bank or to do some kind of errand. I would come back with eyes irritated and streaming. And I'm talking about 2000, which was like way better than now. And my fingers would be covered with rash. And every time I left the city and I returned, this refrain would play in my head saying, poison city, poison city. So I began thinking about poison and did a huge amount of research also on the fact that poison and medicine have this peculiar relationship where medicine can become poison and poison can become medicine. And then I came to finally a very well-known popular myth, which is the story of nectar turning into poison. For me, this idea of uh, uh, the condition of our city, which was in a state of complete toxicity, seemed to completely resonate with how greed, the greed of the gods for immortality, had generated this terrible poison, which threatened to destroy the world. So as you enter the installation, you are looking down, it's a kind of bird's eye view, onto a number of these tower-like structures, each carrying an image of one of the senses. The senses are also linked to the five elements, the five senses. And as you go inwards towards the center of the installation, the whole work is arranged in a kind of mandala-like form. So the city is reworked, drawing from the geometrical device of the mandala, which is again a device of concentration and of transformation. As you come towards the center, you see this video in the center. And in the corners, you see these light boxes, which have images drawn from the garbage landfills of Delhi, where garbage has turned into land. And these are landscape images, images which are treated like British colonial landscape photography. In this whole work, I play very much with the grotesque and the beautiful, with the fragmented and the reharmonized. So there are a number of things that are happening within this installation. As you move through it and come towards the video, which you look down on, so you don't actually see it the way that I'm going to show it to you. Yeah, these are details of the light boxes. This is a small excerpt from the video that lies at the heart of the installation. The throat, which is what it is, which when you look down on it, you initially don't realize that it's a throat. You just see it as a body part, which has this kind of very small, very contained convulsive movement, is both painted and images from the landfills and the garbage is projected onto the throat. The throat continuously struggles to swallow, to ingest, to do what Nilkant, that form of Shiv, did, which is to swallow the poison in his attempt to rescue the world from destruction. However, in this, the struggle never ends. It's an ongoing, continuing struggle, and which is both at the level of the mythic and at the level of the ordinary human. Perhaps we are all Nilkants today, struggling to transform and contain the poison that threatens to engulf us.
I feel like watching it
Yeah, sorry for the
over and over again, because all of it has such a, I mean, it's so relevant for everything that we're going through today. I mean, the work is almost prophetic, and I'll come back to that at the end as well. So we are going to go now to, and I'm glad you've got the water diviner up there, because that's the next body of work that I was going to go to. And you just, described this whole process of research, which is so fascinating in your work, because you start with an idea and then you dig deep, like, you're excavating, almost like digging deeper and deeper and deeper. You read, I know that your entire process, and that, I hope that the next body of work will actually talk a little more about that process, because it's so integral to your work. It's as important as the product that you create. But I'm also going to kind of combine that with another question, because I know that Water Diviner was a site-specific work. And you've often talked about this whole idea of you've often talked about how viewing is so important, or showing your work is so important. So it's not just enough to make work. I think somewhere earlier in the conversation, you talked about how it was dissatisfying to just be confined to the gallery, to the white cube. And so I think your site-specific works have been very important for you. Even the ones that are not site-specific, I know that you take a lot of trouble to show them to people, to have people react to them, to have people ask questions, and to engage with your audiences. But this one I know was a site-specific work, and I want you to talk about that.
So let me just talk a little bit about my engagement with ecological issues. It begins sort of around the time of Nilkant, the last work you saw, and it continues for more than 10 years and continues today. And I have been very preoccupied with the condition of the Yamuna, of the river of the city, which we seem to have turned our backs on. She's no longer a river, she's actually a drain, a stinking black drain. So I have been engaging with the Yamuna at different points over many years. And this is 2008, where I was invited to be part of a public art project, which was cited in many different places of the city of Delhi. This was with Khoj Artists Association. And it was particularly exciting because it was one tied to the metro, which was hopefully going to bring us some kind of relief to the traffic and the pollution that we were facing. So it was linked to metro stops. And we had this wonderful team of architects and urban planners who were helping the artists visit multiple sites. In the time with them, as we walked through the streets of Delhi and from Roshanara Bagh to many, many places, and they were telling me more and more about the urban history of the places that we were walking through, it was almost like an extraordinary sense of how so much of this had once been water. All that we see today, so much of it was waterways. The road that we were walking on was once a waterway. By complete serendipitous chance, which it was not one of the sites that had been selected, I stumbled upon this little plaque outside the Delhi Public Library saying swimming pool. Most intrigued, I went in and found that there was indeed a swimming pool, which was now a dump. It had remaindered books, files, broken fans, rotting mattresses, all sorts of junk, and it was choked with it, but it was once a swimming pool. So let me now take you into that swimming pool. As you enter a saturated blue light. It's dark, you are slightly disoriented, you lose your normal coordinates and references, you yourself have become blue. You glimpse through this piles and piles and piles of books, books wrapped up with string bundles rising up from the floor to the height of the ceiling as the space slopes downwards. At the place that you enter is an old aqueduct, a lion's head, which was a defunct fountain that I then got going again. But what is flowing out of the mouth of the lion is black water. In fact, made black with Coca-Cola. As you move through, running through the center of the space is a gutter. The gutter carries a map of Shahjahanabad and of the place that we actually physically are at this moment. And it shows all the waterways that once ran through this area. That road between the New Delhi railway station and the Delhi Public Library was once a waterway. Chandni Chowk had water bodies in it. So this work was actually, just to go backwards a little bit. So once I discovered this place, I was incredibly excited. And then I lost access to it. I was not allowed to go near it for 6 months, till permissions and all sorts of things had been worked out. But this work started to actually form in my mind. I already had done quite a lot of research on the Yamuna. And all research, stories, myths about the riverine life of the Yamuna, a lot of them associated with Krishna, these started coming in. Material about the kind of fish that used to occupy the Yamuna. They were once dolphins. And the incursion of the tilapia, which was an alien species which survives very well in toxic waters, which had now started populating the waters of the Yamuna. Scientific research, historical material like the map, satellite images of the dams on the course of the Yamuna as she comes down from her source to Delhi. All these began to coalesce into my mind, within my mind, and it's almost like this happened, and then I actually could enter the space and start building these structures out of these abandoned books. So the research was an extraordinary, it was almost like things would just start coming together. There was a body of research that already existed, and then everything that I tried to follow would yield unexpectedly rich results. And I researched for about 6 months, gathering information, images, materials, documents, and these then all appear within this swimming pool, the water diviner. My desire was to move away from the kind of hectoring discourse that we have in relation to water. We are told to conserve water, we are told not to contaminate water, but we're all basically, our relationship to water has become one of desperate consumers. How will I manage to get enough for my needs? There are fights at the water tap in Bastis. People steal water. I mean, our relationship has become one of consumption. And yet, our culture is full of deep symbolic and metaphoric relationships to water, where water is life-giving, transforming. A lot of this is cloaked now in religious ritual. But I found that in all that I did, I found these nuggets of ecological wisdom buried under these stories. So I dug out these stories and retold them within this space. So as you move through, you encounter images, and I'm going to show you just, these are animated, illuminated books, light boxes in the shape of books, which sit amongst the mounds and cliffs of books that you find all around you. This is an image which kind of brings into a very uncomfortable relationship the classic image of gopis bathing in the river and the trash that is in the river today. So it's about collapsing and kind of almost forcing into a very peculiar relationship, an uncomfortable tension, images of pre-modern riverine life of the very same river, drawn from miniature paintings in one instance, and the actual photographic condition of the Yamuna today. Statistics, documents, this is a woman singer on the banks of the Yamuna. What you find scrolling on the other side is a very beautiful story, which I'm not going to tell you, which is about this extraordinary sensitivity to sound. along with statistics on sound pollution and decibel measurements in Delhi. The story that I will tell you very briefly is the story of Balaram. Balaram is the brother of Krishna and desires Yamuna. Yamuna, however, is only interested in Krishna. This is the goddess Yamuna and the river. The river and the goddess are continuously the same and different. So what you see is the classic depiction of Balaram, and below is the satellite image of the first dam on the Yamuna as she leaves Yamunotri. So as the story goes, that Balaram desired Yamuna. One day when he was a bit drunk and overheated, he was in this forest grove and he yelled out to Yamuna and said, "Come here and cool me off." And she was most offended. I mean, you don't talk to a goddess like that. And she said, "If you need to bathe, come to the river and bathe." And he puts out his plow. And this is very significant because this is the tool of the farmer. I mean, no disrespect to farmers, particularly at this moment, but it is the farmer who needs water in particular ways as opposed to the cowherd or the grazer or the nomad. And he uses his plow to pull Yamuna towards him. The image is of a woman being pulled by her hair. And there's this long sequence, this conversation between them where she objects and she rails and she weeps. And then he will not relent. And then finally she realizes that her power would be destroyed by being broken into a number of tiny rivulets, which is what this action would do. So she agrees and floods the forest grove where he is. Could this be the first dam in mythology?
That's absolutely lovely.
You move from the pre-colonial, the pre-modern to the colonial, emblematized by the lion's head, which is a colonial fountain, to something that actually goes beyond historical calculations, which is a video of an elephant in water. So you go from contaminated water to pure water. It is an image of hope, but also of despair, because the elephant implodes, dissolves, and then reforms. I'm not showing the video because of lack of time, but I'm showing you a few stills from the video. It is an intense, immersive experience, and each viewer participant is actually invited to be a water diviner, to read these subterranean histories of water through cultural memory, personal memory, and through history. I mean, the site specificity, I think, is very obvious. Yeah. I think it's very important to say that as a public artwork, a very wide range of people came into this installation. They were the people who used the library, the normal library goers, ranging from elderly people reading the newspaper to children to students, to people off the street, to groups engaged in ecology. There was some Youth for Ecology group that used to come and in fact became guides in the installation, to street kids. And one of my most amazing moments was to come in and see this little boy standing completely open-mouthed looking at the elephant. And they told me that he comes in every morning. He was wonderstruck. And that sense of wonder, which we have lost because we have actually received so much and seen so much, was very precious. Again, a visitor's book, again, conversations and discussions. And for me, this was one of the most satisfying things I ever did because of this very diverse and rich kind of community participation. People really responded to the stories. They sometimes recognized them. They sometimes made up their own versions of them, which was fine. The guides themselves became, it was quite an educational process with them because I tried to tell them not to direct people, but to allow people to actually express their responses before telling them what it was about. So it was also trying to shift this idea of what raising ecological consciousness or increasing awareness about water could be The Lieutenant General Governor of Delhi came and visited at that time and assured me that it would not be possible to make this installation in terms of the condition of the Yamuna after 2 years. This was absolutely not true. And in 2012, I made another site-specific public artwork called Black Waters Will Burn, which is about the increasingly degraded condition of the Yamuna that I discovered in 2012. I just wanted to bring that in because of the public art aspect before we go to the next work.
Yes. So coming back to Winged Pilgrims, Sheba, it was made at a moment of sickness. And I know that, the Locust work and Winged Pilgrims were made at a moment of sickness. And we're experiencing something very similar today. And I thought that should be the work, or those should be the works that we end this conversation with.
Well, I'm going to actually just show you images and perhaps talk a little bit as we go through. There was a crisis around what was called avian flu, Asian flu, and it was a near pandemic. It didn't become a pandemic, but it led to the murder of a huge number, the killing of a huge number of birds all over the world. And it also led to the attempt to control the migratory movements of birds from Asia to the rest of the world for the first time in history. In this work, I use extensively a device that I developed, slowing down, that I talked about in the beginning. This is adapted from a street toy, and it is a moving image, but a still image. It is a still image moved by mechanical means, a light box, but with a moving layer. This movement, which is in a loop, creates a kind of as you enter the installation, this sound focuses. These are animated light boxes. All the images you'll see are animated light box with a very slow movement of one layer while one layer remains still. So here the birds falling out of the sky move across the ropes. There are three key elements in this installation: the figure of the pilgrim, the witness, emptied, turning outwards, showing images of men in contamination suits. This is a device, as I said, adapted from street toys, from kitsch popular objects, which show fantasy landscapes. I then developed my own fantasy landscapes, which tried to map a kind of earlier Asian cosmopolitanism. What do we mean by Asia? So exchanges across Asia with the linking metaphor of the bird. And for me, landscape traditions and the bird, each place has very rich fables and stories about birds, which for me actually become a prism to look at our relationship to the natural world, to ourselves and to the natural world. So there are these sculptural figures, and then you move across. The whole room is structured as a loop. You move across these light boxes, which is quasi-historical. So each of these light boxes actually carries a story or several stories embedded in it. This is one I'd like to tell you, which is the story of the Kaha bird. The story reoccurs from Persia to Japan, across the whole stretch. I started off with India, China, but actually had to expand my canvas to include Japan and what was called Persia, for us to actually get a sense of the kind of movement of ideas, metaphors, and relationships that traveled across what we call Asia. The earliest travelers were the pilgrims who carried texts, who carried stories across, and these then start reoccurring and mutating, of course, but manifesting in both sculptural form and visual form across. So here is the Kaha bird. It's a Tajik story in one of its original forms. There was a poor fisherman. The fisherman was barely able to catch anything. He was quite old. Sitting disconsolate by the riverbank one day, this gorgeous bird appeared next to him and said, "Why are you so sad?" And the farmer said, "Well, what I have today is not even enough to feed me and my wife." So the bird said, "Don't worry, may your basket always be full," and flew away. And so it was, the basket was always full. And the fisherman prospered and began to even sell some fish, and he had plenty to eat. But word spread about this magical bird. Now I'm cutting short the story. And the king of the regime heard about this bird and, of course, wanted to possess it. So he called the fisherman, and the fisherman, tempted by greed, agreed to hatch a plot along with the king's men. So the next time the Kaha bird came, he said to the Kaha bird, "You have given me so much over the years. Do me the honor of coming to a banquet that I would like to arrange for you. Come and eat with me." So the Kaha bird agrees. And the fisherman lays out this banquet, but hiding in the bushes and the trees and all around are the king's men. So as the Kaha bird begins to descend, she sees all these men hiding, waiting to catch her. And she is so horrified that she immediately starts to rise up again. The farmer, in his desperation, tries to hold on to her, and she flies away with him, dangling from her talons. Another story of greed. And here you see the Kaha bird encountering the ships of imperial colonial expansion. Both move in this slow way, where you see the reflection from both sides across the devastated landscape of our very own Yamuna. This gives you a sense of the transparency. It's translucent, transparent, and you see the shadow of the loop as it goes around. And each time the relationship between the moving figure and the ground changes and really produces a very special quality of attention. This is the whole installation. And I come back to this last image, which I think has become peculiar to see now, because it has become part of our everyday life, where we see people in PPE suits, where it has become, just ordinary to be masked and gowned in this manner, where earlier it was something that only specialized people, health workers, had to wear for fear of contamination, or people in nuclear facilities, etc. This has become our norm today.
Sheba, would you like to touch upon edible birds, or am I pushing it too far?
I think we could just talk a little bit.
Okay.
So maybe, I must say that I feel like I've rushed through all these works, and I hope you've got some sense of what they're about. But
Okay. So Sheba,
what I'm trying to say is, I think the key things that I want to share today are about how my concerns, which are not simply about particular issues and particular political concerns, but how feminist philosophy actually informs the choices I make in the kind of questions that I follow, in the kind of research I do, in the kind of relationships I try and build, in the kind of conversations I hope to open, the kind of dialogue that I like to create, the sort of critical thinking that I am inviting people to engage with through these practices. And I'll end here.
Thank you so much. And you just said what I was going to say. So you took away my little conclusion by saying it all. We could go on and on with this absolutely fascinating conversation, Sheba. And I also know that really it isn't doing justice to your work, because I also know that you've had to rush through, and I felt very guilty, kind of pushing you through this, because I know that we can, all the work deserves, each of the works could actually be discussed over an hour and a half. And I know that there are major bodies of work that we have not even touched, but I'm hoping that this has given people an entry into your work, and I'm sure that links will be put up and people can actually go and, explore the work a little more. So I think that it will open up an entry for everybody else. As always, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to speak to you, and lots of love from where I'm sitting today to you. But I'm now going to ask Subasri to take over with questions.
Thank you, Gadi.
Thank you so much, Gadi. And thank you so much, Sheba, for the past 90 minutes. It's been an absolute privilege, especially so because, I often say that we're living in these times where there is a tyranny of time. Everything is so fast, right? And your invocation to us to slow down our ways of looking, right? Or to bring a quality of attention to the world around us, not just in our works, but in how we are living, so that a space for dialogue and conversation is opened, is something I personally, among many other things, I think it's going to stay with me for a while. And I suppose, and that's what art does. Art does call your attention to the world in a particular way, in a layered, nuanced way. And I suppose your work shows that. So while it may have been a little rushed, we do hope there's another opportunity for you and Sabeena to have this conversation in a more leisurely way, where we're not looking at, okay, there's 10 minutes more, 15 minutes more, let's wrap up. Inshallah, that will happen someday soon. There are a few questions, but I'm personally very obsessed as a filmmaker myself with this idea of time itself, because I'm a filmmaker, and this idea of cinema is about time and image and space, right? But in your own work, right? In the times that we live in, where I keep coming to this thing of there's a way we're asked to see the world in snippets, right? Whether it's the way we consume our news, or the way we read our books, or the way we express ourselves. And very often, you see, especially with moving image, you're said, if in the first 5 minutes you've not reached your audience, or you're not able to communicate, then you've lost your audience. It doesn't matter. Nobody's going to watch your film or artwork. This is something I just wanted to know from you, that as an artist who has decades of work and who's actually dealt with this relationship of time through different decades in different ways, right? From the 80s to 90s to this moment that we're sitting. How is it that, if you had to reflect, has your relationship to time changed at all? It's a question I had.
I don't know if it's changed. I think it's probably acquired more depth in terms of my understanding. I've always been interested in attention, in ways of seeing which resist the kind of fragmentary experience that the world seems to demand of us and impose upon us. So this comes from actually right from the beginning. A lot of my early studies were in media and society, communications theory, and I think from there, from then on, this has really informed my work. So qualities like intimacy. Intimacy is also something that requires time. It's not something that can be produced in a snippet. So if you just move away from looking at time as only time, you find that a number of other things that you value, other ways of relating, other ways of being, and seeing, to draw upon the title, are actually bound up with time. And we are in an era where we've lost space. I mean, there is hardly anything left that isn't owned or controlled either by the state or by the corporation or whatever, or by privatized, through privatization. What still perhaps remains open as an area of resistance is time. That is rapidly being eroded, and I would actually say it's actively under attack. So for me, it's not just about the contemplative as the pleasure of contemplation, but contemplation as a political act.
Right. So there are a few questions, so I'm going to move on to them. The first is actually a comment from Dr. Mohan Rao, who says, not a question. Thank you both, that is to you and Gadi. Thank you both for a very interesting and illuminating discussion. A great admirer of Sheba's work. So that's from Dr. Mohan Rao.
Thank you, Mohan.
Syed Ali Haider says, with the immense knowledge you carry, the photographic insights you gave, in addition to the soothing voice you have, I can listen to such lectures without interruption. I'm sorry I have no queries, but an appreciation. So that's again a comment.
Thank you, Syed.
Ranjani Mazumdar, hi Ranjani, has a question. She asks, Sheba, you started off as a black and white photographer. With the installations, there seems to be a greater experiments with color. Can you reflect a little on how you made the transition?
Well, in terms of photography, the only time I really worked with color was with the women aesthetics, and that was because color was so critical to their codes. I mean, you recognize, you can locate a particular woman according to her dress and the color of her dress and her markings. So that was one brief foray into color photography. Otherwise, I actually don't like the, this vexed relationship with the real gets even more vexed with color. And I like the abstraction that black and white brings in. I use color, I think, very carefully. So Nilkant, for example, is essentially black and white. You have the blue throat, but it's monochromatic. It's really in the, and Water Diviner is essentially monochromatic with these little elements of different colors coming up. It's really in Winged Pilgrims that the palette just opens out so wide. And I think it was really to do with the kind of materials I was drawing on, which was so rich and where the color was so significant in terms of both speaking of the cultural tradition that I was drawing them from, whether it was Song Dynasty ink brush painting, which is black and white, or the Garud image, which is a golden sculpture, to the miniature painting in deep reds and pinks, which actually, if you look at carefully, is a transitional painting because it shows the beginning of some use of perspective, as well as, and that use of perspective is to show ships on the edge of the painting. So it's a transitional image which moves out. So there are a number of details like that in the material itself. Now, all this material has been drawn on and changed and altered by me. I mean, I have woven my own digital tapestries out of this material. And to keep the color of the elements that I was working with seemed really important. And then once you get seduced by color, you get completely seduced. So in a way, the space itself is quite somber because there's hardly any color in the sculptures, but the light boxes glow with color. The feeling of the work, and particularly with the sound and the somber ambience, is essentially one which is both of beauty and of grief. And I need the color for that. So these choices for me are not, in a sense, formal choices that I'm moving into color, but it's to do with the work itself. The work seems to ask for something, and therefore I enter that realm.
Right. The next is a comment from Anjana Mangalagiri, who says, fascinating, Sheba. So glad that I got an opportunity to get a peek of your work. So that's again a comment. And for now, unless more questions come, the last question is from Sabeena Mishra. Hi, Sabeena. Glad to see you here. Sabeena asks, I also wanted to ask you about the idea of slowing down the way we look. You are encouraging that by your practice. And what does it mean to put out work like this in public, particularly of young people who are increasingly consuming images in a rapid manner? And what can that mean for an artistic practice in future? I think this is a question that consumes many of us who are working with images. So yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say about it.
Absolutely. A number of the things that have been so important to me have really changed their meaning because of, well, the ubiquity of the mobile phone and the mobile camera. So if I argued for self-representation, what does that mean today in terms of the selfie phenomena, and where self-representation is easily available to millions of people? So things shift as time shifts and as technology shifts. Now, in terms of time, I think what I find really interesting is that if you're working with a video that is very slow and there's really nothing else in the space, you lose people very quickly. This is an observation. This is not like some, written in stone thing. It's just an observation. But with the moving image light boxes, I think what also happens is curiosity. They first think it's a video, but then they realize it's not a video because you're seeing the same image coming back. So that moment of what is this? Is it a still image or is it a moving image? Seems to be to create a gap, to create the possibility of saying, okay, let me just look at this to figure out what it is. And once you're looking at it to figure out what it is, you start looking at it. And then a lot of the time, you have entered into the particular temporality, the pace of that work. Doesn't always happen, maybe impatience, but I found really interesting that this little device, this street toy, actually was able to do this for people who are oversaturated. I mean, people who come to art galleries, and not just the young, look at so much that they actually, they have what I call the gallery walk. They come in, they look at something, tuck, 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 and on to the next, tuck, 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 tuck. And you wonder, like, these are supposed to be people writing about the work and thinking about it or coming to galleries. But even there, that space that art offered for contemplation and slowing down has to be fought for. So I think it's something that, as Subasri says, will continue to trouble us, and we will continue to attempt to find ways and means to try and open up this possibility of a different kind of attention.
There are no more questions, but two comments, and perhaps because time is, we are running out of time, I realize the irony in it. I'm going to read out the comments. The first one's from Javed Sultan. Hi, Javed. Who says, it's such a privilege to hear both the artists in an elaborative conversation on the process and impact of the work. Thanks for sharing the knowledge. That's from Javed. And Salma Rahman says, thank you so much for this insightful discussion. I was introduced to Sheba ma'am's work through Black Waters Will Burn. It was wonderful listening to her. She says that.
Thank you both.
Right. Okay. Thank you everyone from PLD, Udita, Surbi, Madhu, and Yasho, colleague here who's helped out with the session. As I often say, as in a film, it's always a director who goes in front and takes the questions. And in a Zoom conversations, there are many, especially in a webinar mode, whose faces and names you will not see, but who are responsible for this. So thank you all. And once again, thank you so much, Sheba, and Sabeena for this really illuminating discussion. I think this conversation will be out soon, and hopefully we will be able to hear you both in person at some point in the near future. Just a quick piece of information. The next in the series, which is the 5th edition of the series, will be on 26th of February at 7 p.m., where the series will be hosting filmmaker Nilita Vachani. So, I mean, that information will be sent out. So hope to see you all. And this has been a really lovely evening. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sheba.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gadi. Thank you, Subasri. Thank you, PLD, Udita, Yasho, everyone. And thank you all for being here. Thank you very much.